The Holy Roman Empire is one of the most interesting states in European history. Famous, or rather infamous, for its decentralization and powerless emperor, as well as being centered on Germany more than any actual Roman territory, it would last just shy of 850 years before being dissolved by its last emperor, Francis II of Austria, due to Napoleon's dominance over Europe. However, before the 1600s and the Treaty of Westphalia, the HRE was a truly powerful state, stretching from the Netherlands to northern Italy, while controlling Bohemia and countless other territories. When it was unified, it truly was a behemoth of Europe, able to contain the might of France, corral any number of nomadic raiders, and challenge the power of the Eastern Roman and later Ottoman empires. Which begs the question, what if it didn't? What if the Holy Roman Empire never existed? Well, to start, we need to go over what the HRE was and how it started. The Holy Roman Empire traced its legitimacy back to Charlemagne, who would turn Francia into a powerhouse, controlling France, Germany, and northern Italy. However, this empire eroded mere decades after his death, and in 887 it split into the kingdoms of East and West Francia, Germany and France, and Lotharingia, which got stuck with the richest lands along the North Sea, Rhine, and even Italy, right in between its more stable neighbors. The Carolingians would quickly die out in Germany, and in 912, Henry the Fowler would be elected by the nobility, bringing the Leodolfing dynasty into power. Now, we don't actually care too much about Henry. For our purposes, we need his sons, Otto and also Henry. In our world, Henry was able to appoint his son Otto as heir to Germany, giving him a quick election. Otto would then go on to defeat the Hungarians at the Battle of Lechfeld and marry the Italian Queen Adelaide. It would be this marriage that gave him the ability to conquer Italy, whereby deposing the king, his enemies in the papal state agreed to crown Otto as the Roman emperor. From there, the HRE would remain the most powerful state in Catholic Europe for about 300 years until the Great Interregnum irreversibly damaged royal power, after which it was largely dependent on the personal base of power the emperor had. So, for our point of divergence, we just need to have Otto the Great die young or otherwise become unable to become king and thus emperor. Instead, it's his brother Henry who inherits both Saxony and East Francia. Now, frankly, this scenario gets hazy very quickly, so this will mostly be about trends and broad strokes history more than individual kings. Now, Leodolfing Germany was a bit more cohesive than its contemporary France, but Henry wasn't out to create a centralized absolute state akin to Anglo-Saxon England or later France, and allowed for powerful stem duchies, so long as they recognized his supremacy. Otto, in contrast, centralized power much more around himself, which, while viable in the short term, does seem to have left the HRE more vulnerable than it might have otherwise been. So don't expect anything nearly as bad as France, which required a literal 100-year war for the Capetian and Valois to even feel like kings, but at the same time, this will still very much be feudalism. While the individual nobility will all be impossible to know, something about killing one of the most important monarchs in European history, I think, there will still be periods where the nobility is more powerful and some points where the king is the state. Now, in this world, Henry II would be very much in a position to centralize power, inheriting Saxony from his father and being able to claim Bavaria due to some dynastic ties, which would easily make him the most powerful man in Germany. Now, annoyingly, there isn't too much we can really go by for precedent here, since the early HRE was very much tied into Italy and Romanness, and the entire concept of this video is not doing that. Much of Otto II's early reign, for example, was made problematic due to a marriage to a Byzantine princess and problems with Italy, and neither of those events make sense to happen here. The Leodolfing period would likely be dominated by wars with pagans, the Magyars of Hungary and the emergent Vikings of Denmark, specifically. In our world, Otto the Great secured himself with the Battle of Lechfeld to end Magyar raids, but if he's dead at the time, those raids will continue until someone else does them in, likely Henry II or his brothers. Fights with the Danes will likely follow similar trajectories to our timeline, although I would suspect they'd be seen as a bigger problem with the king actually being in range of them. The conflicts with Hungary do also tie into another similarity to our timeline. Germany would invest heavily in control of Bohemia. It was a powerful duchy at this point, and its mountainous borders also mean it would be a natural defensive border against Hungarians, Poles, and whoever else shows up at the gates. It would be a fairly loose, almost personal relationship for the first several centuries, and Germany may never permanently secure it, but it would still be a consistent subject of the early German kings, almost like England and Wales or Scotland. In addition, Bohemia would be seen as something of a base of operations to Christianize the Slavic tribes east of Germany without overt and expansive subjugation. While I don't think that Mieszko of Poland or some other stand-ins conversion would be butterflied away by the lack of an HRE, there are still attempts to make him convert earlier than he did via tribute to the emperor. That said, I still think it would come about due to seeking an alliance with Bohemia, which would tie it into the German foreign policy web. Getting back to divergences, I think that the German-Hungarian rivalry would continue into the next several centuries. They have a very long frontier, and both of them have strong, often competing ties over Bohemia and Poland. As a result, expect any internal conflict in those states to become proxy wars between pro-German and pro-Hungarian factions. Now, Germany absolutely has a lot of conflicts with France, especially during the roughly 5-minute intervals where the French monarchy is actually able to control their kingdom, meaning that conflicts over Flanders and Lorraine will be highly frequent as well. The exact map at this point is obviously impossible to predict, though. Interestingly, France will likely find a strong ally in Hungary during most of these conflicts, something about 2 front wars. With strong competition and rivals, Hungary might actually be forced to, / more able to, centralize without its own stem duchies weakening it. But at the same time, it could also get a century of dud kings and child monarchs and wind up worse than in our timeline. Now, Germany was only about half the HRE, and Italy itself is also highly important to consider. Now, frankly, this could go any number of ways, and I think the likeliest outcome of Italy not being able to marry Otto is that she's stuck with Adalbert of Italy. Now, seeing as he spent several years in exile, this is literally all fiction. However, I would expect that the Italian kingdom would have horrendous relationships with the papacy, while the Pope worked with just about everyone who prevented him from being conquered, often including Lombardic and German nobility. However, it's very clear that any Lombard king is going to try and expand south. Probably first into Byzantine holdings, but the Papal States would also be targeted eventually. Frustratingly, it's impossible to get a timeline on this, so it's also impossible to know what that means. Now, the Pope can definitely expect some level of privilege no matter when he's conquered, and obviously papal independence versus the Italian monarchy will ebb and flow, but obviously this whole mess will have implications on the church that I can't answer. There's also the possibility that the papacy flees to Germany or France, either for restoration or for shelter. They did spend about a century in Avignon in our world, after all. But a united Italy is not going to be a pushover on that front, meaning restoration would be difficult. The investiture controversy is almost certainly localized just to Italy, since the Pope would be in a serious power struggle to control the clergy of the Kingdom of Italy, and very importantly, would not be able to do a damn thing in Germany. Now, united Germany and Italy do have some pretty big implications on the Crusades, if they happen. While I don't think the adventures in the Holy Land will be much more successful, both of these states existing and being centered on their own cores rather than the peripheries, will be able to get up to shenanigans closer to home. Germany likely still supports orders of crusading knights to convert the land of the Baltic states, especially if the Kiev and Rus still adopts Orthodox Christianity. In contrast, while the Normans probably can't conquer Sicily or southern Italy from the Lombards, they might still be able to get Italian help for conflicts in North Africa. That being said, I don't think that these would last much longer than in our timeline, since they're still facing all the same problems. At best, there's a duchy or two loosely affiliated with the Kingdom of Italy. It's the German military orders that I'm interested. At some point or another, Germany will have a civil war, and the Teutonic Knights, or whatever you want to call them, will gain new autonomy unlikely to be relinquished. Now, they could still go down a similar path to our world and get sucked up into the Polish orbit, or they could wind up becoming de facto independent countries. It's rather hard to say, since any German king would want the orders rendered as tributaries like Bohemia, but them not doing that is likely vital to Polish and Lithuanian national interests. It's very hard to say what happens, but for the hell of it, we'll say that by the 1500s, the Livonian order on the Baltic coast is de facto independent, while the Teutons have been subjugated by Poland. Can't have everything be a win for Germany, that would just be bad storytelling. Now, let's actually explore some details of Germany. The Ottonian line likely survives a little longer. In our timeline, it had to switch from Otto's Saxon line to the Bavarian line, leaving the subsequent Henry II weak. But here, that Bavarian line has always been on the throne, and there's more pressure on all of them to have more kids. Plus, they'd literally all be different people after the Fowler died, so who knows? We can just roll the dice more. Point being, while it's only a matter of time before dynastic trouble, the odds are in Germany's favor that succession does eventually get whittled down to some kind of primogeniture, without any electoral shenanigans. This also means there's a strong likelihood that the royal present will be cemented somewhere. While most courts were itinerant, meaning they traveled with the king, some city or palace was typically favored. This is basically how London or Paris got their capital status. While it's somewhat / very impossible to know where this goes, I do have some contenders. Aachen was Charlemagne's favorite residence and founded by the Romans. This would easily make it one of the most prestigious cities to focus the German monarchy on, and could well be enough to win it the prize of German capital. Cologne would also be a major city, home to a powerful bishop and a decent population. And finally, Bremen would be a prosperous port town on the North Sea, although prior to the Viking Age, there might be some obvious risks. But you know what's not a risk? Subscribing to Alternos Mundos for new alternate history content every week. Now, honestly, this video is getting very close to the realistic predictions are impossible threshold for a number of reasons. Just in the medieval period alone, the 100 Years' War, if it still happens, which I do think it would, is heavily changed for one very simple reason. it is much harder for the Duchy of Burgundy to take over the Low Countries. Those territories are right next to the center of royal power in the northwest of Germany, meaning that it would be a nightmare for Germany if they were able to fall into Burgundian hands. In addition, the foreign policy of the Germans would play a huge and inconsistent role in the conflict. For example, let's say that the Germans support Edward III trying for the Kingdom of France so they can take a nibble at Flanders. Of course, at the height of English power, they would also then be terrified of such a union no matter how cumbersome, and thus they would support any French resistance they could. Similar situations would arise as the Scandinavian tribes centralized into actual kingdoms. Denmark, being the most populated and wealthiest of the three, would easily be something that Germany would want, but honestly probably couldn't hold for the first few centuries. But at the same time, the prospect of the three uniting would be almost existential for Germany. Now, in real life, Germany, Norway, and Denmark all formed a personal union for about 200 years. Now, this was a personal project of Queen Margaret of Denmark in the 1300s and is incredibly unlikely to come up on a second roll of the dice. But if anything like that comes up, Germany would absolutely hate it, and would support Sweden or Norway in the event of a revolt. In general, Germany will be very keen on keeping the Baltic Sea under control. Not necessarily every king, but whatever dynasty takes over in the 1200s to 1420s would absolutely hate the continent battleground. Battle water? Battle sea? Now, let's assume the Ottomans still take over the Byzantine Empire. Germany is going to have a very complicated reaction. Firstly, Hungary probably just got its ass kicked. That's every German king's greatest wish. On the other hand, if Hungary falls, now Germany is the front line. Well, them and Italy, who probably also made some pickings at the Balkans while Hungary and Serbia were getting their shit rocked. In addition, the Iberians probably do what they did in real life, albeit under different dynasties and monarchs. After all, it doesn't take a genius to realize Portugal probably isn't going to win enough of a war against Castile to take over southern Iberia. Columbus probably cries at Spain enough to get them to go along with his ideas. Wait, crap. Columbus can't do that. A unified Italy means Genoa never rises to become a major city that would produce a pear-brained madman to do it. Okay, so as to keep the scenario somewhat on track, we'll say that some random Spaniard conveniently named Columbus does it, and Spain subsequently conquers the Aztecs under Cortez. What happens now? Well, if we weren't in pure fiction before, we sure are now. Even if Spain has the exact same look as in our timeline, there's no way to guess anything. Germany could honestly colonize anywhere, although given where their coast is, I suspect the most logical organic settlement would be around New England in this world. Or New Germany, I guess. Also worth noting that they'd absolutely have some random Caribbean islands, but obviously details on that are literally unknowable. In addition, in our world, this is about the time when Spain got tied up into German affairs via their alliance with Austria and control over the Netherlands, while they and France competed with each other in the Italian Wars. While a German-Spanish alliance is possible, even likely, the circumstances of any Italian wars are very difficult to guess, and they're probably entirely impossible. Oh, and Italy could theoretically try something in the New World, but that's probably a footnote in Brazilian history books, not anything serious. Another very complicated situation is that the Protestant Reformation is kind of impossible for every single reason you can think of. The church is probably radically decentralized, the German world is much more united, meaning it's harder for the Duke of Who Cares a Stott to convert to Protestantism and live to tell the tale. And just as a cherry on top, by this point there's like 600 years of completely alternate theology behind any potential reform. So while the world is going to look a lot more Catholic, it will be noticeably different than you would expect. But I'm also not qualified to talk about that part in the slightest. Now, interestingly, the United Germany means that major wars will be fundamentally different. In our world, from about the 1300s to the 1700s, you could count on Germany being divided and aligned against itself to some degree, while this is a bit less common here. To be clear, up until the 1700s, feudalism will still exist. Nobility will still be a problem for most monarchs, and I can easily see a number of flashpoints. Maybe Hungary decides to support Bavarian independence, or some kind of quarrel over Bohemia. There will absolutely still be major wars, but their flashpoints and the fronts that can even exist will be fundamentally altered. Unless Germany just falls into a civil war every time there's a major conflict, which I think would be fun. Now, we crossed the pure fiction threshold a while ago, but unfortunately we're reaching the literally baseless claims line. So I think I'm going to have to end the scenario here. Germany and Italy exist centuries early. The concept of a Roman Empire in the West has probably not existed since Charlemagne, and Hungary is a perpetual nuisance in the German side. The church being weakened means that the Protestant Reformation probably doesn't happen, which absolutely has massive consequences for England and Scandinavia, but there's no real way of guessing what anything looks like at this point. But if you liked the video and want me to try a part 2, please subscribe and tell me down in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.